birthday was Monday. Now I finally get to go home and enjoy it with some Burger King. Here I come, baby! Burger King! Burger King!
Today we'll be stepping back from the usual Essential 8 format in order to have a conversation about James Toney's epic 2003 campaign. James Lights Out Toney is legitimately one of the most fascinating fighters in boxing history, and that special year he had back in 2003 was the most interesting and inspiring chapter of that unforgettable career. Most boxing fans know that that year represented the peak of an unlikely career resurgence after Toney had spent more than half a decade squandering his breathtaking talent. But I wonder how many people know just how bleak things got for the man during the mid to late 1990s. If you've been following this sport for any length of time, you've seen plenty of guys go down the wrong path and never come back. Whether it was Scott Harrison, Ricardo Williams, or Michael Dokes. James Toney came so close to becoming one of those guys. The fact that he found his way back from all of that was a blessing not just for him, but for anyone who loves the sweet science. Today we'll sift through the details and give this all-time great the credit he deserves. But before we get to what happened in 2003, we need to get in the time machine and go all the way back to 1991. "1991 was the year the world got to know James Toney. It was the year he came from behind on the scorecards to knock Michael Nunn all the way out to win the IBF middleweight title. When he did, it almost seemed like he had spontaneously materialized on the scene. After the fight, people were left asking, who is James Toney? Although he had been a competent amateur, he didn't have an Olympic medal. And he lacked real high-profile connections with a major promoter. Because of that, he had to work his way up the ranks, fighting in relative anonymity in venues like the Hyatt Regency in Dearborn and the Premier Center in Sterling Heights. Although he had beaten several quality opponents to earn his title shot, he flew under the radar. Remember, this was before fans had the internet to learn about and keep tabs on promising prospects. In those days, it was difficult to get attention unless you were a top priority for a leading promoter. As Toney was building his record and sneaking up on the middleweight elites, he was perfecting his craft under the tutelage of Bill Miller. Miller was a no-frills sage from the Detroit boxing scene, and Miller had come of age idolizing the greats of yesteryear.
For 7 decades, Miller has studied the sweet science, and now he imparts his encyclopedic knowledge of the sport to James. Professor Miller tutors his young student with the help of vintage fight films, particularly those of an old friend from Cincinnati, former heavyweight champion Ezzard Charles.
We'd always watch the man's combinations, then we'd watch his defense. How he could make a man miss, slip and slide, roll and counter, and still have good position, good balance, and knew where he was at all times out there. And these are the things that, we should talk about. Says, you're going to do all of this here. And we should always say that you're going to be better than these guys. You're going to take what they had and improve on it.
Miller worked to coach Toney into becoming that type of fighter, using shoulder rolls, feints, and clever, minimalist footwork. Miller was the man who forged Toney into the fighter the world would one day come to marvel at. A grumpy, mean-spirited virtuoso with a gigantic chip on his shoulder. So with that background established, let's get back to Toney and Michael Nunn. It's 1991. Toney knocks out Nunn and instantly becomes the hero of blue-collar fans and boxing snobs alike. For several years, the media had been actively grooming Nunn to be the successor to Sugar Ray Leonard. When Toney beat Nunn, he inherited a lot of that energy. Granted, Toney couldn't fit into the mold of being a clean-cut, easygoing media darling like Sugar Ray. So instead of being the next Sugar Ray Leonard, James Toney was sort of like the next Marvin Hagler. When you think about it, that's pretty much just as good. Toney never wasted energy putting on any make-believe nice guy persona. He didn't need to. As soon as he stepped between the ropes, he was must-see TV. He wasn't just a defensive maestro, he was also a serious puncher who could take you out with one hard, well-placed shot, or a whole bunch, whatever it took. On top of that, his chin was basically god tier, and he absolutely loved fighting. This was a guy who spoke at length about how much he loved hurting and humiliating his opponents. After he knocked Nunn's block off, he defended his title 3 more times in 1991, which was enough to net him the Ring Magazine Award for Fighter of the Year. After pocketing that award at the end of 1991, Toney continued his rampage through 1992, 93, and 94, backing down the best opponents at middleweight and super middleweight. He outthought and outfought men like Iran Barkley, Anthony Hembrick, Tony Thornton, and Prince Charles Williams. All of them excellent fighters, all of them helpless against Toney's harmonious blend of offense and defense. In November 1994, Toney found himself in a super fight against Roy Jones Jr. It might be easy to forget what a big deal this one was at the time. Toney was a 2-division champion, unbeaten in 46 fights, while Roy was the reigning middleweight champ with a perfect 27-0 record and a blend of speed and power not seen since Sugar Ray Robinson was at his peak. Both men were rated in the top 3 of the Ring Magazine's pound-for-pound list. You had 2 all-time great champions, both unbeaten, squaring off in their prime. Those were all the ingredients for an epic fight. What transpired after the opening bell was sublime and unforgettable. Unfortunately for Toney, it was memorable for all the wrong reasons. Although he and Jones were both all-time greats, the gulf between the two on that night was unbridgeable. Jones's superhuman talent and unorthodox style presented a riddle Toney was unable to solve. Toney mostly stayed near the edge of the ring, doing little but trying to ambush Jones with overhand rights. Jones never put himself in that danger. He moved around freely, blasting Toney in the mouth with power punches and throwing flurries to the body. In the third, he even scored a flash knockdown on Toney. Although a few rounds were close, the majority of the fight was thoroughly dominated by Jones. It was the most one-sided super fight of its era. Although Toney was outclassed and humiliated against Jones, the expectation was that he would dust himself off and continue his career without missing a beat. Initially, it looked like that might happen. Toney was back in the ring exactly 4 months after the loss to Jones, but Toney lost that fight to a then unbeaten Montel Griffin. Although Toney bellyached about the judging after the fight, he was stuck with his second loss in a row. It's not totally clear when the problems really began to close in and affect James Toney. Rumors about his volatile personal life and his dislike for rigorous training had been swirling for years. Indeed, his persistent problems making weight, first at 160 and then at 168, were so well known those problems were even featured before the telecasts of several of his fights on HBO. If Jim Lampley and Larry Merchant are wondering aloud about a fighter's level of dedication across several years and across multiple weight classes, I think it's safe to say that there might be an issue with self-discipline here. Toney's problems reared their head with a vengeance after the loss to Griffin. He went from having a death grip on 2 separate divisions to competing for inconsequential belts like the WBU World Light Heavyweight Championship and later the WBU Intercontinental Cruiserweight title. To make matters worse, Toney split with Bill Miller after the loss to Griffin. And even worse than that was the fact that the separation was actually initiated by Miller, who was vocal about his frustration over Toney's disinterest in serious training. When Toney did make the time to train, the problems followed him there. There were stories from behind the scenes about Toney having temper tantrums during training camp, as well as altercations with journalists and sparring partners alike. News broke of an especially severe dispute when he came to blows with Johnny McClain, a cruiserweight gatekeeper who is best known as Layla Ali's first husband. McClain and Toney's trash talk swiftly escalated into a no-holds-barred fight complete with headlocks and cheap shots. Then, Toney achieved even more unfavorable attention when his new trainer, former champ Eddie Mustafa Muhammad, publicly complained that Toney's camp had ripped them off for $60,000 in unpaid wages. That dispute over payment came in the aftermath of Toney's loss in a rematch with Montel Griffin, and it reinforced the perception that Toney's career was completely crashing and burning. What further reinforced that perception were the details that Mustafa Muhammad shared with the press once he split with Toney. According to Mustafa Muhammad, Toney entered training camp for that fight with Griffin, weighing in at a whopping 232 pounds. Said Mustafa Muhammad, quote, "To say he was huge wouldn't even begin to describe it. The only thing I could do was to try and get that weight off him. We had no strategy for the fight because the only strategy in camp was to get that weight off." Later that year, Toney was released from his contract with Top Rank Promotions. When Top Rank dropped him, the chief rationale was his weight and lack of professionalism. In 1997, Toney found a new trainer, Freddie Roach, to fill Mustafa Muhammad's spot. I want to emphasize that this was Freddie Roach before training Manny Pacquiao had turned him into a household name. Roach had a gym in Los Angeles and a successful career as a former fighter, but little else besides that. One other asset Roach had in this new relationship was that he and Toney had a shared history together.
Mickey Rourke had a boxing gym called the Outlaw Boxing Club. James Toney was training for the Roy Jones fight there. I had nothing to really do with him. They were just using my gym, and I lived there.
I had a bad day at the gym. One of my sparring partners got the best of me today. I wasn't feeling too good, right?
He got mad and he threw a chair through the wall. I went after him.
I said, "Freddie, I ain't got time for this shit. Get out my face before I mess you up."
He told me, "I'll kick your ass, white boy." I says, "But you'll know you've been in a fight when we're through. Come on, let's go."
He threw me up for the rest of the camp. And after that, that's when we bonded.
That shared respect was a solid basis for a partnership. The two kicked off their association on the right foot, with Toney winning a trilogy fight with Mike McCallum in February 1997. It would make for great storytelling if Freddie Roach was the missing ingredient who turned Toney's career around that quickly. Although it would make for great storytelling, it wouldn't be true. In his next fight, with Roach in his corner, Toney looked dismal as he lost to Drake Thadze. In the run-up to that fight, rumors swirled about Toney's personal life and legal situation. It was said that he still undertrained, overate, and smoked cigars. He had sunk to his lowest point. Toney fought just once in the next 2 years. The man who had once been hailed as a reincarnation of Ezzard Charles had seemingly guttered out way too soon, a great man consumed by his own appetites. The show was over.
I'm in total great shape, better shape. I think this is the best shape I've been in 6 years, since the Barkley fight. And I've trained 6 months, hard, every day. I may have had 3 days off in the last 6 months. I've been working very hard. And the purpose of this fight is get all the ring rust off and let everybody know that James Toney's back and he's serious.
Improbably, his career began to show life when he scored 3 wins in 1999. He won a pair of fights in 2000 and 2 more in 2001. By the end of 2002, his win streak had reached 11 when he stopped Jason Robinson to put himself in line to fight for the IBF Cruiserweight title. His opponent was the daunting Vasily Jirov.
Jirov was one of the first figures in what became the wave of Eastern European post-Soviet fighters coming to the United States to try to make money in professional boxing. He was a precursor to the Klitschkos and Gennady Golovkin and Sergei Kovalev.
As Jim Lampley pointed out, Jirov was among the first wave of fighters to emerge from the former Soviet Union, and he was steeped in that foreign mystery. What was more important than Jirov's mystique was his stature as a fighter. He was an Olympic gold medalist with an unbeaten record and 5 successful title defenses to his credit. This fight was fireworks from before the opening bell. There was chaos the week of the fight when Toney erupted at the pre-fight press conference. After launching into an animated tirade against Jirov, Toney then got into a profane shouting match with Jirov's cutman. Toney was physically removed, leaving tipped-over tables and broken glass in his wake. The mood was so dark that the managers agreed to weigh both fighters in separately to avoid any more opportunities for extracurricular violence. That tense atmosphere followed the fighters into the ring.
Touch the gloves, gents. James, touch the man's glove. Thank you.
Hard right hand by Toney.
Yes.
Hard punches by Jirov there. Hard right hand by Toney. Backs Jirov up. Both guys had their moments.
Very good round. Toney is landing the more effective and precise punches, but with the pace that Jirov is setting, if Toney doesn't knock him out, it's going to be pretty rough on him going down the stretch.
For the winner by unanimous decision and new IBF Cruiserweight Champion of the World, James "Lights Out" Toney.
After beating Jirov for his 3rd world title, Toney invaded the heavyweight division in earnest, signing for another major fight, this time against Evander Holyfield. Holyfield was still a megastar at this point, thanks to his rivalries with Riddick Bowe, Lennox Lewis, and Mike Tyson. Although Holyfield was 42 years old, he was just 1 fight removed from beating former champ Hasim Rahman, and before that he had split a 3-fight trilogy with John Ruiz. This wasn't vintage real deal, but the man could still fight. That fact was evident early on. Holyfield took the first round decisively, using lateral movement to get into position to land his lead left hook. Holyfield carried that momentum into the second round, where he continued to get his punches past Toney's defense. Although Holyfield was winning rounds, he was losing the fight. His punches bounced harmlessly off Toney's chrome dome, as Toney was landing his own shots. While Holyfield was unloading with wide swinging flurries, Toney was digging in with efficient, surgical shots up the middle. By the 3rd round, the momentum had shifted in earnest, and it was Toney who was pushing the pace. In the 7th round, the fight began to resemble a methodical, brutally drawn-out execution. Then, in Holyfield's corner after the 8th round, Holyfield's cornermen had the demeanor of pallbearers at a funeral.
Listen good to me. If you don't stop getting hit with them right hands, I'm gonna stop this fight, man. You hear what I'm telling you, man? You gotta take charge, man. I care too much for you to see you be getting hit with these right hands.
That's exactly right.
Right on.
Getting hit with right hands that you shouldn't be getting hit with. Okay. You gotta go.
You want another round?
You want another round?
The beating continued in the 9th round. After 2 more one-sided minutes, Toney sent an off-balance Holyfield to the canvas with a glancing punch to the body. Although the exhausted Holyfield managed to beat the count, his corner waved the white flag. Knocking out Holyfield vaulted Toney into the Ring Magazine pound-for-pound rankings at number 9. On top of that, once the year was over, Ring Magazine also gave Toney the prestigious awards for both Comeback of the Year and Fighter of the Year. That was Toney's 2nd award for Fighter of the Year. He'd first won that category in 1991 for beating Michael Nunn and Reggie Johnson. Now, remarkably, he had won it 12 years later for beating Jirov and Holyfield. James Toney's 2003 comeback is one of the undisputed feel-good stories in the history of the sweet science. Although he received the award for Comeback of the Year in 2003, that brilliant comeback began all the way back in 1999 when he started to claw his way back from the brink. He made that comeback in the same way he climbed the ranks in the first place, fighting in venues far from the spotlight, beating a succession of opponents until the world had to sit up and take notice of the fact that James Toney was once again an elite fighter. I said that when he beat Michael Nunn, there was a feeling that Toney had come out of nowhere. There's a nice symmetry in the way he took the boxing world by surprise in 2003. How did he do it? How did a checked out underachiever who had burnt all of his bridges come back from personal and professional oblivion? How did a faded champion stranded in no man's land fight his way back from the brink to win 13 consecutive fights and earn a spot on the pound-for-pound list? I think the answer hinges on why Toney went on that skid in the first place, and I believe the reason he did has everything to do with his loss to Roy Jones Jr. We've often seen fighters' careers take a dramatic turn for the worse because of a single fight. I think that was the case here. Although James Toney didn't take a terrible physical beating in that loss, I think he was so thoroughly outclassed on such a public stage that it literally changed his life. In almost every article and interview I read in preparation for this, Toney mentioned Roy Jones, even when the main topic had almost nothing to do with Jones. Toney would talk about how he was weight drained in that fight, and how Jones didn't really beat him, and that Jones didn't fight like a real man. But the weird thing was, in multiple interviews across the span of years, he had a consistent refrain about how he had lost his love for the sport of boxing after he lost to Jones. That loss to Jones really did poison Toney's feelings about boxing. It removed all the joy, and that explains everything that transpired after the loss. It explains why he split with Bill Miller, a man he had always referred to as a surrogate father. It explains his chaotic relationship with his managers and his promoters. It explains all of the tirades and outbursts and all of the extracurricular adventures that never made their way into print. It also explains his descent into sloth and gluttony. James Toney once said, "I was born to fight. Everyone else was taught." He lived that motto, and when he lost to Jones, he lost a big part of his identity. So what changed? How did Toney regain his mojo? I think the answer lies in that layoff between 1997 and 1999. Although he wasn't doing anything inside the ring, He was busy making all the right moves in real life. It was during that time he met Angie, his future wife. That relationship stabilized his perpetually dysfunctional personal life. It also helped him settle into his role as the father to his young children. By the time he returned from his self-imposed hiatus, it seems that Toney had a new perspective on his career. With new priorities and a new perspective, Toney was able to shed the weight of that loss to Jones. He was ready to move on to his greatest glory.
Now I want to see. Look at the man. You got to give him his props.
Okay, Mr. Toney, I didn't think that you could beat the seasoned Evander Holyfield. I didn't think you were really ready. I didn't think you knew what you were talking about. And I was surprised that you were rewriting history with Roy Jones. But you did a great job, and I commend you. Whether you accept it or not, I'm man enough to say I was wrong. You did a good job, and I'm going to come do your yard work like I promised I would. The bet, whatever.
That's what I had to get out. So what's next?
Okay. He said he was going to deliver Evander, and he did, because I woke up and Evander was singing gospel in my front yard.